Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Stratford Festival on film streaming of William Shakespeare's Timon of Athens. We did this production in 2017. It's a beautiful production directed by Stephen Ouimet, and I have with me two truly extraordinary actors. They're among Canada's finest. And I'm talking about Joseph Ziegler, who plays the title part, and also Ben Carlson, who plays Apemantus and in this production. So are you guys there? Joe, Ben?
Hello.
Hello.
Great to see you both. And I assume you're both keeping very well in this crazy time.
Yep, everything's going just not too bad.
Well, you know, here we have a play like Coriolanus, like Lear, and like Antony and Cleopatra that was written in that period between 1606 and 1610, when the theaters were closed for all but 9 months, and it was a time of plague. And this particular play is unique. It's not performed all that often. There's no evidence it was performed during Shakespeare's lifetime, but boy, does it feel modern. Rather than me recounting the plot, would you guys do that for me? Joe, what is Timon of Athens about?
Wow. Timon of Athens is, as you say, it's an extraordinary play, and it's a play that I think eventually makes us ask questions about what we're doing here and what we ought to be doing here.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a preachy play in that regard. And if I'm making it sound like it is, I'm wrong. But it's a play that he seems to be changing gears a bit, Shakespeare does, and not making everything so black and white and so these people are good and these people are bad. It's not that kind of play at all. It's a play that questions, what do we owe to each other? What are we trying to do in this world?
Beautiful. So Timon is a patron. He's a philanthropist. He's giving money away. He says, I'm wealthy in my friends. He's there for people when they need him. One of the characters falls into debt, is going to be sent to prison, and Timon redeems him, manages to get him out, and then refuses payment of that debt back. He said, that wasn't a loan, that was a gift. But then when he needs money, when he runs out of money, no one's there for him. And that's transformative.
Yes, because he didn't expect it. He, of all things, he did not expect that his friends would let him down because he believed in those people, every single one of them. It's a heartbreaking play in that regard.
And of course, Shakespeare sets it up so that even before Timon comes on stage with this beautiful scene I want to come back to later with these two artists, we know to expect it. We know what is probably going to happen. Certainly Apemantus probably expects it, right? He's a cynic, and
He doesn't bank on charity. He doesn't bank on reciprocal charity. I don't think what he doesn't expect is for Timon to go as far as he does. And that's the great journey for Apemantus, is to watch Timon completely what's the word? Iconoclast? Is that the right word? Is to completely annihilate him in terms of his own, to use a phrase that is in vogue right now, his own self-isolation, because Apemantus thinks of himself as a separate and, untethered by the constraints of society. And then he gets a look at what that actually means, what that really is. That's the nature of, that's what Apemantus's role is in the play.
so once that painful stab to the heart happens of ingratitude, which Lear talks about, Timon goes out and just goes and leaves the city walls and banishes himself and wills destruction on Athens. Let's come back to that later. Let's go to the beginning of the play. Let's go to, why is Timon so generous from the beginning? I mean, he's amazing.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's who he is. He has been fortunate in his own life to have had everything that he needed when he needed it. And I think he's used to having good friends and relying on them and spending time with them. And because of that, his whole view of life, capital L, life, is such that he believes in it, which is the opposite by the end of the play. He changes completely. But he's a person who believes in human beings and in their goodness.
Joe, he's unique. I'm sorry, Ben, I want to come back to you. He's unique in the canon because he doesn't have any family that we can find like that. And also related to the friends, he seems to really want to be there for them. So does that increase his exposure to, they are his family in some sense?
I think that's true. Yes, I think that's a good way of looking at it. He does need people. I mean, that's an amazing thing about him. He ends up without anybody, but he does need people, and he needs, I guess he needs their approval. He needs their love. He needs their affection.
And Joe, we find out later, he's a military man. Like, yes. That doesn't seem obvious at first, but we find out later when the Athenians want him to come back and protect Athens, that he's a great general and captain.
Yes, that's right. It's
an odd series of combination of things that suddenly get unearthed, the different qualities of this guy.
Yeah. It's a very, I feel this way with those plays that Shakespeare wrote at this time, and even the later plays, that Shakespeare was just heading in different directions. I was going to say he was tired of writing tragedies, but that's not true. I don't think he ever tired of writing tragedies. I think in a way this play is a tragedy, but he never got, he was really into what makes people tick. How do people relate to each other, and what do we get from each other?
And I'm sorry I cut you off, but why is Apemantus so cynical? And if you have any theories on why Timon is so generous, unleash the dogs.
Well, what I was going to say was it made me remember when we were discussing the play, I asked that question in rehearsal at one point. I stuck my big mouth in and I just said, Joe, what's wrong with Timon? I mean, why is he giving all his stuff away? What's going on? And in a typically passionate response, Joe said, there's nothing wrong with him. There's absolutely nothing wrong with him except that he has faith in people, and which completely changed my mind about how I saw the character. Because in a typical, I was playing a cynic at the time, so I was probably particularly cynical about it. But I remember thinking there must be something deeply wrong with this man. But Joe's answer impressed me a lot, because what happened was the burden of the kind of sociological and existential, poleaxing that happens to Timon. It was not based on some character flaw, although there could be a character flaw there, but it wasn't based on that. It was based on faith that was eliminated. And that's a really, really interesting and strong kind of monolithic place from which to explore the play. It's a pretty bleak portrait of what can happen in the world. It impresses me as a play. What you both talked about, the nature of Shakespeare's experimentation. It's a big dramatic experiment. He's a new playwright trying something on for size. Doesn't really surprise me if it was never performed in his lifetime. It's a pretty challenging piece, and it's a piece that people would look at and go, what's going on? What is happening? But it speaks in a way that certain of his plays really speak today, like Troilus and Cressida. That's a play that talks right now to us. And I think Timon is another one of those plays.
That's beautiful, as you put it. Like, our natural response is to say, oh, he's giving me something. He's being generous. What's he want? What's behind it? What's wrong with him, right?
That's where I come from at it. But Joe, quite rightly, I think, he didn't shut me down, but he steered me right.
Joe, can you talk a little bit more about that sense of responsibility to your fellow man, your faith in other people that we don't see much of in our world today?
Yeah, I think in this play, it is not questioned. I think before the play starts, there is no question for Timon of what his position is in the world, what he's supposed to be doing, how he's supposed to be doing it. That is, to share what he has, to make the people around him comfortable, to keep them happy. I think that's the way he looks at life. And so it's a huge surprise for him when this is not reciprocated later in the play. He can't understand it. He does not understand what is happening, how people could act that way, because he genuinely doesn't believe in that.
Ben, you play a character who is quite the opposite. I mean, he is always looking at the cracks and flaws and the cynicism of the world around him, which, let's face it, isn't misplaced. He's probably right 99% of the time. What was it like playing that kind of character? It must be a weird place to go to.
It was terrific. I loved it. I love playing those kinds of characters because they are us, you know? I mean, Timon is us. That's what's so good about Shakespeare. They are all us. And the big sort of secret is that you know, people think about him as an old writer. I don't think of him as old at all. I think the reason that he works and the reason that he is so relevant is that he somehow got it all. I mean, I'm not saying anything that anybody hasn't said, but he got all of us. And Apemantus just makes sense in the same way that Timon makes sense. You know, I mean, he shows us two people, one of whom has a huge amount of faith in the world, one of whom has very little. Then he reverses that and shows the man who has very little just how much that man depends on those people on whom he has so little faith, and just how much he is a part of that society that he claims to have nothing to do with. He gets shown that by somebody who completely extricates themselves from it. So, yeah, it was a trip to play Apemantus, actually. I'm really glad I got a chance to do it.
You mentioned two people, and there seems to be a bit of a binary system in this play in the sense that there are two banquets. You know, the artists come out at the beginning and have a scene, and then they come back to you after you're gone. It just keeps on coming up, this contrast between what happens the first time and then what happens the second time when you're together. On that journey of that descent into misanthropy, the blow that happens when you find out no one wants to give you money back, all the people that you helped, you then have a second banquet after feasting them. And what's under those all covered dishes, which is, I guess, a great way to explain humanity. What's underneath those plates? A bit of a spoiler alert. And why that in your mind?
He is so hurt. Timon is so angry and hurt by what his friends have not done for him, that the only thing he can do is the opposite of what he's always done. So he has always fed them. He has always made sure they had everything they needed. And instead of that, he pours water on them and tries his best to humiliate them in the way that he feels that he has been humiliated.
Later in that, once you drive everybody from the stage, Joe, the actor, are left on the stage with really just the audience, and yet you rail about the injustices and what you want to have happen. It almost feels like you're talking to the people today and calling BS on what's going on today.
Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like doing it too, because the play is sweeping you along. You've got 10 seconds off stage to, fix your makeup or whatever you have to do, and then you and you come back on, and the world is not prepared for you, and you are not prepared for the world that you find. It's extraordinary.
Can I talk to you about debt? So that moment when you have Ventidius coming back, you've saved him from debtor's prison, and which is a weird concept, that if you borrow money, even though the injunction in the Bible is against lending at a rate, that you might be put in prison. You save the person, and when later on they want to pay it back, you don't take it, and you say it was a gift. Can you tell me about what that means about his worldview, about giving and?
Yes, I do think that Timon realizes at the beginning of the play that he is much more fortunate than many people, and because he is in that position, God has decided that he should be generous. God has decided that he should give and never hold back. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on there. And he doesn't have any, so he doesn't have anything to restrain him. He has no concept of it. So when it finally happens, when the world crashes down around him, he is completely unprepared, I think.
What's Apemantus's view, like when you were playing the part at that point, not in part 2 when you rediscover Timon, but what's Apemantus's view of all this?
Of all what, specifically?
Of the fact that they turned him down, of the people, like, is this so good?
Unfortunately, Apemantus tends to, at least initially, resort to "I told you so." You know, I mean, it's, you know, that he, for all of his railing on the vicissitudes of men and the inability of people to come up to their higher self, Apemantus can't really come up to his higher self, which would be to eventually show up and say, "Timon, why don't you come home with me? I have a bowl of soup for you." You know, like if they were friends, that's what he should do. But something in him does not allow that. He has to prove his superiority in a way. And that, I think, is Apemantus's tragic flaw, if you will, is his sense of being better than. Because he gets proven pretty roundly when he does finally catch up with Timon that he's not better than anybody. He lives square in the middle amongst the people that he despises.
Then part 2, Timon goes outside the city walls. There's a funny, I want to just talk a little bit about the water thing, because, you know, Stephen really had this in his production. The first half was wet. The second half was arid and dry. And after you throw water at people, I was rereading it, and those lines about asking the sun to take the water from the earth and breathe the rotten humidity that will infect people's lungs. It feels like you want to use, and then of course I was thinking about liquidity in the currency sense, that idea of, you know, just keeping the money flowing, because the money is only good if it flows, right? So part 2, you're digging for roots.
Yes.
And you find gold, which is fantastic. Before we get to the gold that's stuck in the earth, not able to do anything because it's not liquid, let's talk about roots for a minute. Roots are mentioned more in this play than any other. And in part 1, Ben, I'll ask you to comment on this. When Timon's holding this beautiful feast, you're doing what?
Eating roots. Eating, like, you know, vegetables, root vegetables. Yeah.
Yeah. Rich men sin.
It was carrots and celery. Yeah.
Yeah. And I eat roots. And then you're digging for roots, Joe, in part 2. What is with the root metaphor?
Because there is nothing more basic, I think, is what he's getting at. Root is the only thing I can get that will not cost anybody else, will not cost me anything. I have to dig for it, and I have to brush it off and clean it and all that. And everybody knows that eating a root is like. I don't know. Maybe I just assume everybody knows, but and
it's honest, right? It's not fancy.
There's nothing fancy about it. It's not even tasty. There's no salt, you know. So I think that's what he's getting at.
And then in part 2, you come up to him, Apemantus, and you offer him an apple called a medlar, which is, you know, extraordinary to be offering the apple to someone, of course, with all the rich associations with knowledge. And Joe, what does he make of that?
He doesn't want to be beholden to anybody, particularly Apemantus, especially when he offers him that meddler. Meddler meaning also a person who meddles, who interrupts somebody's life, and which is what he has done to him in some ways. He doesn't want a meddler. He does not want to be beholden to Apemantus for anything, I think, at that point.
And yet Apemantus seems to like him better than ever before, right, Ben?
Well, he's more, yeah, he says that. And he actually, I think what happens is his eyes get turned inside out, and suddenly he can't actually believe that this is the same. He knew he liked him, and he was never quite sure why, you know, and now the amount of the fierce emotion that is released, but also the fierce intelligence and the fierce ability to see the world for what it is. I think Apemantus is just blindsided by that, and in a way can't get enough of it until the gaze is brought on him, and then it's pretty tough. And then they just start yelling at one another. Then they just start calling each other names. It's pretty fantastic. There's a couple of times in Shakespeare when that happens, when people just call each other names. I think of Kent and Lear. So what am I? Oh, let me tell you what you are. It's just wonderful for an audience to watch people just scream at each other. It's fantastic.
And although you now see him with new eyes, as you say, you leave doing something, a bit of an act of violence to him, in the sense that you go back and tell Athens where this hermit is. You expose him, which I guess is a journalistic thing to do, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. I hadn't thought of that, or at least I hadn't thought of that in the last year or two or three. But it also, of course, is just a good plot thing as to why the people who then come as they do to see Timon, which has to happen for the end of the play, to evolve.
Joe, Timon finds gold instead of roots. And most people, if I had lost everything and suddenly I find gold, I go, okay, great. I'm going back and I'm going to be less nice to everybody. I'd like to think I wouldn't do that, but that's not what Timon does.
No. He is resolved to be at enmity with the rest of the world. I don't know if I said that right, but he does not believe in people in the way that he did at the beginning of the play. He now, as he comes to a place where he loathes mankind and everything that mankind has done to him. He'll never get over that.
He does realize, though, that gold still has power, negative power. What does he do with it?
He tries to give it away, tries to get rid of it because he doesn't want it. And eventually, he does leave the money there. He doesn't. I always found that a bit bizarre in the play, that he finds the money in the last act and that he doesn't do more with it, that he doesn't use it more to, maybe he does.
Well, he does give it to Alcibiades, some of it, to wreak vengeance. But maybe the answer is that it's a poison in and of itself that needs to be left alone.
Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like, I remember. Yeah.
Guys, I want to ask you a question now, not as the two characters, but as two actors. The play starts out with a pretty scathing scene about a poet and a painter. They are pretty clear-eyed about what they're doing and what they want from Timon, but boy, they don't know themselves. And in that scene and in what happens later, it feels like this first spotlight that Shakespeare shines is on his own people, on the artists. What did you think of all that in those scenes?
I think you're right. And I think that's what you can see that in other of Shakespeare's work at the time, that there is a changing viewpoint to how he sees the world around him. I hadn't thought of that before, really.
Well, I think as artists, we always feel we have this mission. And here is perhaps the greatest writer ever exposing that as hypocrisy. Ben, what did you make of that?
In a lot of the plays, and this isn't a particularly original idea, but a lot of the plays that come from Shakespeare and what we think of his high period, like a little bit after Hamlet, but you might as well throw Hamlet in there for good measure. Plays like Othello, Lear, Macbeth, all these plays that are being, written around, not too far off from the same time period as Timon, are all concerned with a word that comes up right at the end of his writing, which is tempest. And the tempest seems to me to be about the human soul. This play, Timon, is about what happens to a man who loses his soul into or perhaps finds his soul in an enormous tempest. But you could say that about all of the plays I've mentioned and a whole lot more. In a way, the greater global view of that is, I have a feeling that Shakespeare had a healthy amount of self-loathing during all of that period of his writing. His writing is too intense not to. I can't imagine that he wrote his plays and, sort of had a nice drink at the end of the day and went to bed. I think he was probably up nights screaming at the world. You can't get to the insolence of office and the spurns the patient merit of the unworthy takes without that kind of real angst. And Timon is a reflection of that, but so are the poet and the painter. That's all about him. That's all about his own cynicism of having to continue to write plays to make money to eat. Just a healthy kind of like Joe said right at the beginning, what are we doing here? What is this actually all about? Why do we keep going? Why am I continuing to do this? That's my opinion.
The Tempest is a beautiful thing to cover because, and actually, when we were working on Richard III, of course, Clarence's Nightmare is all about a tempest and, that dark night of the soul and water, which we're coming back to. Now I want to come back to your thoughts, Joe, about what Ben just said, but also the water, because Timon insists that he wants to be buried in the verge of the sea, on the hem of the sea, where once a day the waters will come over and join him to the... What did you make of that?
It just felt like something that he could rely on, something that was always going to be there, dependable. Because that's one of the things that he had the hardest time with, was that he couldn't trust anybody. He couldn't rely on anything to be regular and usual and normal, like the tide, the coming in of the tide and the going out. That's what it felt like to me.
This is, as we said at the beginning, it's such an incredibly important play. And it's a play that really speaks to us today. This was a modern dress production that works so beautifully in the theater that Stephen put together. After having performed these parts, can you both tell me what this did to you and what you think this play means for the world today?
Wow. Yeah, I'm not over it. I'll tell you that. I am not over the experience of having lived this story and gone through it as many times as we did. Because I found it mind-blowing, because I didn't know that Shakespeare went in those directions, or maybe he does in all the other plays, and maybe this play opened it up to me or something. But I found it amazing to be in that play and to be in that world. It was unforgettable.
It was unforgettable performance, Joe. It was really heart-wrenching. Ben, final thoughts on the journey Joe took and the journey you took?
Well, the wonderful thing about playing Apemantus for me was that I got to watch Joe play Timon. It's a play that doesn't come around very often, as you said. It's not as well known as the other plays. It is a huge, as I think I said before, it's a huge dramatic experiment. It's really weird in its structure, and it's, you can't see it coming. There's no way you could sort of anticipate that a play like Timon could ever be written, let alone, performed. But clearly he had an astonishing actor in Richard Burbage, because the part is monumental, and in a way where it gets to is what I said before was monolithic, and it requires everything an actor has to give. You need all of it. It's one of those parts that Shakespeare wrote so many of those parts, but it's one of them. And it was a great pleasure to watch Joe go through that every night and, only have to siphon off a little bit of it for myself. That was great.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Joe, for what you gave us in these performances. And we are in for a rare gem right now. Ladies and gentlemen, join us in watching William Shakespeare's Timon of Athens.